Good evening. Tonight we're out in the shop, and what we're going to do tonight is I'm going to show you how to narrow a Ford 8.8 rear end out of a Ford Mustang. We'll go over some basic things on some measurement. I have a kit here that I've ordered and I've had for a while now that we're going to break into. I'll show you the parts of the kit and how the kit works, and we will narrow this rear end. So strap down and have a seat and get you something to drink. Let's have a quick little tech tip day for narrowing the rear end.
Let's go!
Alright, so what you can clearly see here, we have a Ford 8.8 rear end up on our weld table, up on some jack stands. Now I don't have my pieces made for my weld table yet, but what you should always have is a nice clean workstation, unlike what you see here. So, we're going to go over the Mittler Brothers narrowing kit. You can see this, Mittler, M-I-T-T-L-E-R Bros. So what you have here is some basic things. So what you have, this right here is this is your pinion measuring device. So what you do here is you got to figure out which one of these here holes bolts down through the bottom, or bolts down through this piece into the back where the cover goes, or in the front of the 9-inch housing. And that will give you your pinion center, so therefore you can measure out and get your measurements and then deduct the measurement and make an easy mark. This is a very easy way to measure from your pinion. So you can make sure your measurements are center from the pinion or the same distance out, or whatever it is that you may have to do to get the rear end narrowed correctly. So what else we have in this kit is these here are called, the inner puck. So what this does is, inside a rear end, like this one, you have these the bearing caps. So you would pick the one that you would need, which, for instance, what we're going to use tonight is the Ford 9-inch, 8.8, and GM 12-bolt inner puck with a 3.062 bearing size. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these pucks out and we're going to put them inside the bearing space and tighten the cap down on top of it. Now, what that's going to allow us to do is take this beautifully machined, perfectly straight bar, the narrowing bar, or the puck holding bar, or the bar, or whatever you want to call this. And what we're going to do with that is once our pucks are in place, we're going to slide that bar through the rear end, and then what we'll do is we'll take our outer puck, which we have multiples here, so these came with 2 different pucks, and one puck, or one pair of pucks, will do the Mopar and Dana, and also the Ford and Olds rear end. And then you have the truck 8.8 along with the GM. Well, I don't see what size GM it is. Probably the small GM. And then you also have the car 8.8 and GM, I guess, assume 8.5. So those will go on the outside. Now, this rear end already has 9-inch ends on it. So what we would do is we'll find our 9-inch rear end puck, or housing end puck. That slides right in here. So, let me get this set up, and I'll show you a little more in just a second. So let me bring you in here and show you a little closer what's going on inside of the ring and pinion area. what would be behind the cover here and kind of show you a little more about what's going on with this narrowing kit from Miller Brothers. So we have the bearing caps here, okay? And you have the inner puck that gets squeezed inside of the bearing cap, or the bearing for the ring gear carrier, or your spider gears, or your just whatever you may have, your locker, or whatever's going inside of here. So these squeeze inside of that, and then you have the machined bar that runs through the whole length of the rear end housing. And then what you have is the outer puck that slides onto the end of this machined bar, pretty tight fit, and then that will slide into the housing end. Now, like I said, this has a 9-inch housing end on it already, and this side was actually done pretty well. That's a pretty decent fit there. But what I found out is on the other end, or the other side of this, it isn't very good. Now, whether it may be that the ends were installed correctly when it was narrowed for the first time, or whenever the 9-inch ends were put on, maybe it was done right, maybe the rear end has gotten bent since then, I don't know. That's something else you can use this Miller Brothers kit for, is to diagnose whether you have a bent rear end or not. So we're going to get our pinion marker set up here, and we're going to take some measurements and clean the paint off this thing and make some marks, and I'll show you kind of what's going on with that in here in just a few minutes. So something you didn't see here, because the phone messed up on me, is I use the spinning wheel of death here to remove the powder coat or paint, whatever it was they had on this rear end. It was pretty hard stuff. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to grab me some measurements. I've already got the measurements of what the width was currently. Customer says they'd like to have 1.5 inches off both sides. No problem. So I'll measure out. I'll subtract whatever that amount is. I'll make a mark on the housing, and I'll decide how much that is. It needs to be removed from both sides, obviously 1.5 inches. But then I'll show you how I make a perfect mark on this all the way around in order to make it a nice clean cut with a grinder and cutting wheel. I have a bandsaw, but my bandsaw is really not set up to do this type of cutting. Mostly thin stuff like exhaust tubing or roll cage tubing, things like that. So I'll show you how I make marks on both sides, and then I'll show you how we cut and things like that. We'll get these housing ends cut off, and we'll get them tacked back up and welded back on. And I'm going to make some marks here, like this here, just straight, so I can keep this housing end straight on the rear end and not get it cocked a different direction than what it was before. So you'll see me doing some work and some things, and we'll get you right back in here up close and show you what's going on. All right, so I'm not going to mess with this current weld here. I don't want to try to cut that back off and really mess with that, because the weld looks really nice there. So like Mosier does and a lot of other companies, they actually cut a chunk out of the rear end housing and just weld it back together. So that's what I'm going to choose to do today. It'll be just fine. So it was 1.5 inches. I did recheck, so we are going to cut 1.5 inches out of this tube here. Now, how I made my lines is, if you take a piece of paper and you wrap it up, if you keep the edge of that paper lined up with itself, it has to make a straight line. There's no other way that it can be. So that's what I did here. So I just wound that paper around the tube, and then that'll give us a straight line. Not that having a perfectly straight line is crazy important. Yes, it is important, but our housing, or our outer puck, is what actually is going to make it straight with the other side. But obviously you don't want a big gap here and a small gap down here and a small gap over here. It just won't weld very good. So we have straight lines on both sides. We're going to cut these things off and get everything lined back up and get it tacked back together. Okay, so here's what I was saying about having that line on there. And there is a little bit. There's just a little bit of play in this deal, but not much. So it's close enough that it's not going to make that much of a problem. I'll just find the middle between the two. If I push up all the way, if I push up as hard as I can, it still doesn't line up just perfect. So if I let it drop, if I can find that happy median, we'll be in there. So same thing with this side. It's quite obvious how far this end was off. You know, it's not play in this. I mean, we know this is all straight through here. So that's just how far off that housing end was when it came to me. Whether, like I said, whether the rear end be bent or whatever it may be. So I'm going to get some tack welds put on this stuff. And I'll kind of show you guys how I tacked and some things like that here in just a few minutes. So as you saw there, I did multiple tacks all the way around the axle tube. Now, in the places that were easily just fused together, I just fused those together. I was able to get one on top and one on bottom and one in the front, and almost got one in the back. I had to use a little filler on the back though. But that allowed to keep that housing in place so our outer puck is still freely moving, which is obviously what you want. You don't want it to be tight like it was earlier when I was trying to put the puck in before I cut the ends off. It was so tight that you couldn't get the puck in. So after I fusion tacked it, I got some filler, added some more tacks all the way around. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just add a little bit more length on some of these tacks, working slowly so the weld doesn't want to pull and cause one of the other tacks to break and cause this housing to pull one direction or the other. Because what we want is for this to continue to be loose and nice like that, obviously, so when you slide the axle in this thing, the bearing doesn't get twisted in any particular way and end up burning or causing the bearing to fail. So I'm going to get this piece welded up and let you watch some of that as I'm doing that in hyperspeed. And then after I get finished welding this piece all the way up, I'll bring you in and give you a closer look at just what we did here. So now that we've got this burned in all the way, as you saw, you can't actually look in on the inside of the axle tube, and you can't actually see the penetration that came through as I was welding that in. Believe it or not, it didn't take a whole lot of heat to burn this in real good. I figured it would have took more heat than what it did, but I was only welding on about 120 amps, which was surprising. But this fairly soft, mild steel here really kind of welds like butter. So basically, when you get finished with something like this, kind of what you want is, let me clean this off. What you want is for this puck to just slide right in there, nice and easy. You know, no problem, nice and smooth. It's pretty much exactly what you want, which that's kind of the noise you want to hear, just nice and smooth. That lets you know that what you've done is good. And that everything's still true and straight, even though you've just put a bunch of heat in this thing. It didn't pull or twist or do anything that it shouldn't have done. So now that the ends are both welded on, and this is the correct length that it's supposed to be, The next step we're going to go on is the customer also wants me to put some lower control arm brackets on this. So now we'll kind of switch gears from the nailing process and take all this stuff out of here, and then we'll flip the rear end up and we'll add these lower control arm brackets. Now, he said he wanted the lower control arm bracket, the outside of the bracket, 4 1/4 inches from the outside edge of the axle housing, the axle end. So what we'll do is we'll get a little more of this cleaned off here. We'll set our brackets up, and those things are supposed to, the angle of those is supposed to be the same angle as the back of the housing where the rear cover bolts on. So if this is at 0, the back of our lower control arm bracket also needs to be 0, or at least that's what the customer asked for, so that's what we're going to do. So give me a few minutes to get this cleaned up, and we'll show you a little more action. Alright, so I went ahead and took the liberty of going ahead and burning in one of these here, or the bracket on this side. And I'm also going to fill in this here because they just folded over, and that really needs to be welded in there. So I went ahead and took care of that on both sides and welded on the inside a little bit, just around a little bit there. But I kind of want to show you how I did this other side here. So essentially, I laid the back of the rear end flat. Now it's really hard to get this digital gauge to 0, okay? So I put that on 0, or close to 0, about 2. Now I made this one about exactly the same. This should say, no, the batteries are going dead on this deal. So 0.3, maybe 0.4, really close. So 0.2 of a degree off. That's pretty close. And then what I done was I just kind of held it up there and got it as close as I could. So it's 0.3, about 0.3 of a degree off, which isn't a whole lot. I held it up there and gave it a little tack there and a tack on the bottom, just a fusion tack, so that would hold it in place. I can add a little weld on the bottom to pull that down and make that degree a little closer if I want to. But that looks really good. I'm going to burn this one in. And also something I don't really like is it has this large gap at the top here. Now what I could do is just fill that in with MIG weld, and I may just do that just to close it up, even though that's a huge gap. So I probably won't do that. Well, probably what I'll do is I'll go over here and find me a little chunk of material from the plasma, set that in there, weld it up real nice, so there's no big gap there, and this thing's really solid. So anyways, I'll get this thing the rest of the way burnt in, and then I'll bring you guys in and show you the finished product here. Alright, so we got that burned in real nice. Again, I'm going to come through here and weld these up on both the brackets and do something with that right there, because I don't really like that gap. And then instead of just doing a little bit right here on the inside of both brackets, I stuck my tungsten out. I went ahead and welded farther back in there, which I'm going to do the same thing on the bracket over there. And this was just like a slice mark from the customer cutting off the other bracket, so I went ahead and filled it in a little bit. Got a little bit of crap in that weld right there. I'm sure he'll grind that up and clean that up anyways before he paints this thing. So anyway, that's just kind of a close-up of what we did there. Got around as much as I could without having to change too much about the torch. I am going to come and weld the tips up when I flip this thing back around to work on this little issue here and weld those up. So that pretty much is getting pretty close to being finished here. Again, I'll bring you in for the absolute final finished product, but I'm going to button the rest of this up here and we'll see you at the finish line. Alright, well, here we have it. The final deal. Shortened, narrowed, whatever you want to call it. LCA brackets installed. LCA means lower control arm for the ones that may not know. Filled in those there on both sides, on both brackets. Then on the back here, where those holes were, what I'd done was I actually took a piece of this stuff here, which is actually, I believe, some leftover stuff from my window frames on my doors for the Lexan windows and fiberglass doors on the black car. Cut a little chunk of it and set it in there, and then just welded it up so it had something to actually push it against. So it's not just all weld filled in. That's actually a piece of steel in there that I welded on top and bottom and filled everything in. So anyways, I think he'll be happy. Everything turned out really well. I'm happy with it. It was nice to finally get to use my Mittler Brothers narrowing kit. So that is pretty much going to be it for our narrowing evening. Tune in next time. I'm not sure what we'll do. I actually know exactly what we're going to do. I'm doing a mini tub and through the floor subframe connectors on a friend of mine, Kenny's Mustang. So I'm going to bring you in on that. I got one side about done. I'm going to finish the whole one side, and then I'll show you how I did it on the other side. So I can kind of perfect it on the one side and then show you what I did on the other side. So tune in next time, and we'll see you later.